Hey folks, Steve here with another World in Flames video covering naval mechanics. This video is going to be sort of a special video today because I'm going all out in covering all the remaining naval mechanics of World in Flames to enough detail that a new player is going to grasp the mechanics and have plenty of examples to go off of, and we can really get into some of the detail. I won't reiterate the rules necessarily or cover every single option that's available in the game, but for all of you armchair admirals out there, this video should get you where you need to be to at least get your feet in the water and give the game a play. So, this is going to be a long one. I'm going to endeavor to put the hyperlinks down in the YouTube description here so that you can click and go to the various sections of the video that cover topics that you care most about. Not everyone's going to need a review of some of the naval units, so we're not going to worry too much about that. Or if you're not going to worry too much about that, you can just skip that and go to a different section of the video. Otherwise, we'll work our way through. Again, we're going to be covering a lot of material, so stick with, and we'll have a good time here today. Couple of things. I'm actually using the beta World in Flames Collector's Edition Vassal module. Harry from Australian Design Group gave me permission on BGG to use this for my video recording, so I don't have to be using the final edition version. So everything you see here is brand spanking new, and even as a beta, I think this Vassal module is awesome. So we'll get to use it and show it off a little bit here today, and demonstrate all these fun little mechanics. So let's see. Anything else before we get right into it? I'm going to do a little bit of a summary of the previous two videos that I've did very quickly, just to bring everyone up to speed, and then we'll break into some of the new content. So let's start there and kind of do a quick review of the last video. So in that first video, I talked to just the basic mechanics of moving naval units. And again, a naval unit really is, in terms of movement, cares about its range and its movement allowance. So if we looked at the Emerald here as an example in the upper left of the screen here, I've moused over a stack of Commonwealth units. The Emerald has a range of 3, that's the yellow number, and it has a movement allowance of 6, that's the orange number. The range is going to govern how far away from a port that it starts in can it go, and then its movement allowance will be a function of, or will provide for how well they will operate in the sea zone that they've ended up in. You use movement allowance and range traveling to get to a sea zone, and then the remaining movement allowance that you have at that point will govern what sea box you're in. And again, the sea boxes, as you can see, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, are going to govern basically the ability for you to find the enemy. So the higher sea box you're in, the easier it is to find enemy ships in that sea zone. So as sort of a basic idea, the further range and the more movement allowance a ship has, the more effective it can be, basically. Units with smaller values will probably want to stick closer to a port that they start in, while ships that have much higher values will be able to project power with better quality further and further away from home, and that can be, it's going to be useful for some powers, and just overall, you're going to want to pay attention to what units are going where can they reach with any sort of success, and how do you want to arrange your forces where they're going to be the most effective. Now, obviously, you can have cases where a ship is simply going to leave one port and go to another port. We covered a little bit in that last video. And there are going to be some cases where you might find a naval unit with a range that is higher than its movement allowance. And it's there because basically you can run out of movement allowance, but as long as you still have range, you can continue moving. And that would mean you're only going to ever end up in a 0 box, which is relatively unsafe. So those types of units are really going to be using that extra range probably to get to port, maybe a very far away port, to get somewhere so that they can then redeploy somewhere else in another turn, or if they've been flipped via reorganization or something, they can continue doing other operations. So again, relatively straightforward. If you want to dig deeper into that, you can watch that first video in this series where I try to get into that with more depth, and I have a pretty little graph and all that stuff. But yeah, so now we'll move on to a quick summary of the second video that I covered, which was really centered around the island hopping campaign idea. And let this render a little bit. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm moving over to the Pacific map here to show the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of naval stuff going on here in this part of the war if you're playing the Pacific map or the global war scenario. And really, with the same idea that your ships have limited movement and movement allowance and speed for getting out here, and then the range to get further and further out. How you operate in the Pacific is going to be a function of some of that. So you're going to be looking to, during the course of the game, say if you're the Americans, you're going to be looking to project power out of Honolulu within the range where your ships are going to be effective, and then capture some of these islands in the Pacific. These islands are going to have ports, which will allow you to move your naval units up or rebase there instead of returning back home. And then as you continue to do that, you're also going to have places for your aircraft. Now, it was weird in that last video. I talked a lot about aircraft in a naval video, but it's really the end strategic goal of conducting your naval campaign to support your aircraft campaign here. So if I'm projecting power on Honolulu, I might be able to take Kwajalein from the Japanese, and in this example here that I've set up, the Japanese have control of it. If they've taken Kwajalein, then maybe they've also got Majuro here, and they've got some ports. Well, now the United States is going to project power out this way, and then as they work through, they capture the Caroline Islands. Maybe they get into the Mariana Islands. Then you're looking at positioning your long-range strategic bombers, to be able to bomb Japan. And unfortunately, in that last video, though I caught it after I recorded it, I did make the mistake of forgetting that on the Pacific map, each hex is equivalent to 2 hexes of the European map. So all the ranges for aircraft are almost essentially cut in half from that perspective. So while I was showing some examples of stuff, the reality is even harder. And so if you want to be doing strategic bombardment or to drop the A-bomb in Japan, you're really going to need to capture some of these islands to even have a chance of successfully launching those attacks. So again, this is a great example of, if you're going to start moving these ships out, they can only go so far and be effective. You will then need to follow that up with capturing new bases that are closer and closer to where you want to progress in the campaign. So, very much historically, the United States is probably going to head down here, start taking islands, moving west to liberate some areas, maybe liberate the Philippines, and then they're operating up in here to potentially start those bombing campaigns, and maybe even an actual invasion, right? So all of that to say, again, the naval component of this game is pretty important. And as we go through the rest of this video, we'll get to go into the nitty-gritty bits of that. Okay, so that was the summary of the previous videos. Now let's start getting into the new content. Sorry, I'm coughing a little bit and taking a drink because my voice is probably going to go hoarse by the end of this. So let's look then at a very important topic for the game, which is convoys. So convoys are, and I'll zoom in a little bit, these counters here that have no naval values except for a 10 in the upper right. That is a defense value where the higher the number it is, the worse off you are. So they're really weak, obviously. They're just convoys to transport war material and supplies. In the context of the game itself, convoys have one primary purpose, or I guess series of purposes. And then there's a secondary purpose that it really comes into play if you're playing with a certain rules option. So we'll talk to that in a second. To understand the importance of convoys for the primary method, we need to look at the production system of World in Flames. I don't want to get too deep into this because it honestly could have its own video. But the basic idea, and I'm going to hide the game pieces here for a second, the idea of the production model of World in Flames is that you need to get resources to factories, and then, for every resource you get to a factory, you get a production, and you take your total production after combining all the possible resources and factories that you can make of matches. You take that times a number which is called the production multiple. That depends on what year it is and represents the sort of change in war economy of the nation to get your build points, which are what you use to buy units. Now, that sounds a little complicated. It's really not very bad at all. The only trick is, if you're playing the Commonwealth, who happens to be most affected by the need for convoys, it can be a little challenging and a little bit of sort of logic checking to make sure everything is sound. So, to kind of show this, if you look at the United Kingdom, one of the countries within the Commonwealth, you can see they have a lot of factories here. They're an industrialized nation. They have tons of factories. I think it ends up being like 17 factories here. In order to get actual production, we need to match those factories to resources. And unfortunately for the UK, there are only 2 local resources here. One here and one here. Now, obviously, those 2 resources can get to 2 factories. Very easy. They can be paired. You can trace a line to them on rail, and that's easy peasy, and you're going to get to production out of that. But in order to make use of all these other factories, we need to get resources here, and the way that we get them there are via either, again, tracing some kind of rail line locally, but being an island nation, you don't have very far to go. The other method is with the convoys. So let's look separately maybe at another Commonwealth nation. You can kind of start to see how it works. Let's look at Canada. So I'm going to scroll all the way to the right. And you can see here in the vassal module, we're looking at the North America map, which is very much zoomed out, even more zoomed out than the Pacific map. So within Canada, which is also a Commonwealth nation, we have a lot of resources here as well. So we have an oil resource. We have 4 total regular resources here, and then another one here for 5. 5 regular resources and 1 oil. Then we have, in terms of factories in Canada, we have 2 factories. Now, this is going to be, an easy thing, right? You say, well, 2 resources here to 2 factories. That's going to be 2 production, so that will be added to the total production of the Commonwealth. So 4 at this point, the 2 that we can guarantee get in the UK, 2 we can guarantee get here in Canada. But here we have the opposite problem. We have more resources than we have factories, so we need to transport the other resources. Now, I currently have this vassal module set up to be for the Deluxe Edition, and in the Deluxe Edition, and if you're playing with all the options, there are going to be reasons to not use oil for production. You're going to want to hold it because you use oil for oil-dependent units. If you're just playing the base game and without that option, you just use oil as an extra resource. But for my purposes here, I'm not going to transport this oil out of Canada, at least not right now. So what I'm going to focus on is getting these 3 other orange resources to the UK that can't be used in Canada. How I do that is I need to make sure there is a convoy for each resource being transported in each sea zone between a port, from a source port that I'm moving these resources to, and a destination port in the UK. So the path that I've chosen here is I have 3 in the East Coast, so they're coming out of, we'll say, Halifax. So these 3, 1, 2, 3, 3 convoys in the East Coast, then in the North Atlantic, which, as we can see here, is going to connect to, it's not quite here on the map. I think it's supposed to connect to, for some reason I thought it actually said on here. I must be missing something. The North Atlantic should connect to, oh yeah, here we go, to the Bay of Biscay or the Faroes Gap, and we'll continue into the Faroes Gap here with 3 convoy, which will then come into Glasgow, and then, 2 by rail, any of the other factories here, right? So that's 3 more resources to 3 more unused factories. That gives us 3 more production. So right now we would be 2 production from Canada, 2 locally from the UK, and then 3 more for importations from Canada, which gives us a total of 7. Now, that's still not a lot, and the reality is if you're playing a real game as the Commonwealth, you're going to have convoys coming not just from Canada, but from all over the place. There are some trade agreements with some South American countries. There are resources in Australia, India, South Africa, and all of those you're going to be looking to deliver via convoys to the UK. So one of the things that becomes a strategic thought process, of course, is for all of those Pacific holdings, which I'll run over to the Pacific for a second just to show, you're going to have a fair number that you could be transporting. So, for instance, here in Australia, there's, 1 factory that I see? And yet you have 1, 2, 3 resources. Then we have in Malaya 2 resources. You can't zoom in a little bit, but there's 2 resources there. In India, there are 2 factories, but there are 4 resources here. You might end up with some resources from Iran based on some trade deals. I forget what some of those are. So you have a bunch of resources that are going to be flowing up through here. You also have some African resources that are going to be transported potentially through South Africa. Now, here comes one of those critical questions of the game. Is the Mediterranean open? Yes or no? And for the Allies, this is going to be an important concern for a couple of reasons. So, just to demonstrate, because for every leg of that journey, you need to have the same number of convoys for the resources that you're transporting. It needs to be in every leg of the journey, and you have to make sure that you have for whatever you're pulling out of here, right? And just to show what kind of strain that puts on production, let's just assume that for a second we're trying to pipe through 3 resources out of, India, and we'll just say we're going to take 3 from India. Maybe one of these factories got taken by the Japanese doing a crazy push through here, right? So if we're going to take 3 resources out of India, we're going to need to go by water to get them to the UK. And we've got 2 different paths to take. We can take it by the Mediterranean, or we can take it around Africa. Now, you can imagine that there are going to be some challenges in place, but if we count the path from India via the Mediterranean, let's see how many convoys and thus sea zones, how many convoys and sea zones it will take to get these 3 resources to the UK. So we have the Arabian Sea, so there's 3. Then we're going to take it through the Red Sea, whose box is down here. So here's 3, so that's 2 sea zones. Then into the Eastern Med, another 3. Then we come over to the Western Med, another 3. Then we get into Cape St. Vincent for another 3. Then the Bay of Biscay for another 3. And at that point, we're able to get into Liverpool as a major port, and then, all is gravy from that point. So again, we're going to do the quick count of the sea zones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 sea zones times 3 convoys is 18 convoys needed to keep this 3 resources getting to the UK. Now, ignoring for a second the fact that at any point these convoys could be damaged or attacked or aborted, thus breaking this chain, we only need the 18 convoys to keep this going. I say only, and it seems like a lot. And the trouble is, of course, convoys cost production to make new ones. So there is always going to be this strain of keeping these supply lines safe, which we'll get into in a little bit. Now let's look at the longer path. Let's say the Italians and the Germans have closed the Mediterranean either by taking Egypt, or maybe somehow they've gotten Gibraltar, or they've destroyed convoys in the Mediterranean with the Italian Navy. How does this look? Well, then we have to go from the Arabian Sea here, so 1, down to the Azanian Sea, 2, to the Mozambique Channel is 3, then around to the Cape Basin for 4, which then kind of loops around over here to the Gulf of Guinea for, what are we up to now, 5. Then the Cape Verde Basin for 6, Cape St. Vincent 7, and then Bay of Biscay 8. So now 8. That's 8 sea zones compared to 6. Maybe not a huge difference, but then you realize 8 sea zones times 3, that's 24 convoys compared to 18. That's a decent chunk. And then, really what you ought to be thinking about is you're never just transporting 3 resources, right? You're probably going to be transporting more than that. You're going to be transporting 5 or 6 or 7. It really just is going to depend on the situation of the game and how many convoys that you have. And the upkeep of sending everything around Africa is going to be harder to deal with. It's going to take more resources to get all of that situated compared to running it through the Med, where things are a little more expedient, but also much more in danger. And there's going to be a point where you may even have a turn where if the Med is closed and you haven't properly set up the escape valve for around the tip of Africa, they're going to have to spend time and effort moving convoys to beef up this line to increase the throughput of the resources that now have to go around. And that's going to be a major decision point that you'll need to think about. Now, tied up in that is the idea of protecting the convoys. So protecting them is going to be a little tough, because you're going to have stuff like these German submarines that are going to be out there. There's also the potential for naval bombers or enemy naval vessels, but at least here we have subs. The subs are going to be out there trying to get your convoys and destroy them, or even abort them. Anything they can do to disrupt that chain, because all it takes is, a disruption of that chain, and the UK, the Commonwealth, could miss out on several build points for doing that. If, say, this stack got destroyed, I'll just move it away for a second, move it over here. If that got destroyed, then nothing is going to be able to get through here. Nothing at all. And so if you're transporting 5 or 6 resources through Cape St. Vincent and the convoys are all destroyed somehow, well, you're going to get nothing from the rest of the world at that point. This is an important little pivot point, unless you're rerouting them around to the North Atlantic or something. Anything like that, it's going to be a big pain in the butt. So a big part of the game is this strategic warfare of protecting the convoys, sending ships out to patrol and protect them, try to hunt down subs. Again, very big part of the game. So we'll restore that for a second here. Now, all of that is related to that primary use of convoys. If you wanted to know about that secondary one, there is an option that is basically a limited sea supply option. And what it does is it makes the logistics game even more difficult, because what it does is that if you're operating with units that are overseas, you need to have convoys in the adjoining sea zones or the adjacent sea zones all the way back to a home city that can provide supply to wherever you're at. And this is going to be kind of a challenge for the Japanese if you have this option in, because wherever they're operating, you're going to need their convoys. So if I just look out here as an example, in the regular game, you simply need to have, I think it's just some surface ships in the sea zones to trace that supply path from Tokyo. So, from here to the China Sea, to the Bismarck Sea. You could trace supply to the Caroline Islands just by having some service naval vessels out here. And I forgot to put these guys out here, so I'll just throw them there. You just needed the capital ships, which capital ships aren't squishy. They're there. They can fight battles, whatever. You can trace supply to the Caroline Islands and Kwajalein, no problem, whatever. But with this limited sea supply option, you're going to need convoys in each and every one of these. So what happens when American subs enter and now, say, destroy these convoy points? Well, it means that even though there might be other Japanese naval vessels out in the Solomons, now Kwajalein might be out of supply. And so this is going to be one of those things. It's an interesting option to play with. It increases the challenge for logistics. It's a little more realistic because you have to have something there shipping supplies, and I believe it can simply be one convoy point, but you probably are going to want extra just in case something gets destroyed. But you're going to need these out here to provide those supply points. The only other thing I'll say on convoys before we get into other stuff is just that in the base game, if you aren't playing with Ships and Flames, you're going to have your convoy points in denominations of 5 or 10, and that's it. It's not very flexible, and what I've heard people do is they will get Ships and Flames and they'll use all the extra convoy points that come in denominations like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Instead, just because it's more flexible, because having 5 in every sea zone, it can be a real pain in the butt. But if you can break that 5 into a 2 and a 2 and a 1, then things are a lot more flexible. And so something to keep in mind, I guess, if you're playing with Ships and Flames, you're going to have all of this stuff anyway. Everything I have on the screen here is Ships and Flames, so I guess keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this video. Not that it matters too much. All the concepts we're going to cover are the same. Just that, again, having that flexibility of the convoys is going to be, in my opinion, much easier to deal with than an annoying process of dealing with big denominations that can't be split. Okay, so we've covered a lot on convoys. Let's just get into, very quickly now, the rest of the kinds of naval units that are out there. So we talked about convoys a lot already. To cover really briefly the numbers on the naval unit counter. So the first number on the top left, besides the range and movement allowance, and on the top left here, that is their attack value. So ships are going to have an attack value. You add those up for combat factors in combat. They have a defense value. Again, higher is worse. It's sort of like an armor class rating in old school D&D. The lower it is, the better you are at avoiding damage. So 4 is pretty good here in this battleship. Then you have the shore bombardment rating, which factors into supporting combats on coasts. If you're looking at an aircraft carrier, that bottom right number is actually going to be a colored box, and that is its air component. And we'll get into that in greater depth here in this video in a little bit. But just to say, higher numbers typically better in both cases. The aircraft carrier doesn't have its own shore bombardment value. And then finally, in the bottom left, that is going to be your anti-air rating. So when ships are attacked by air units, which will happen, you will use the anti-air rating to help shoot down those bombers that are trying to hurt your ships. So those are the 4 ratings on all naval units, but obviously there are going to be some units that simply don't have a very good allotment for that. So we talked about convoys, no big deal. There are also, and I'm just going to throw some examples on here, there are also transports. So this is what the back of a transport looks like. It's sort of like a flat ship with a couple of smokestacks. Yeah, and as we flip it, whoops, there we go. it will be sort of these two ships side by side. This is a transport unit. So a transport unit is obviously used to transport land units or aircraft between locations, and transports can carry, each transport can carry one core-sized unit, meaning a regular land unit, um, or one aircraft. Alternatively, depending on what options you're playing with, it can also hold, I think it's like 2 divisions and up to 2 carrier planes, something like that. So, basically, as the Germans, you're probably not going to use them very much. But the transports are going to be useful for the Americans, the Commonwealth, and sometimes, yeah, definitely the Japanese at times, for moving units back and forth, preparing for your D-Day type of setup, just ferrying things back and forth uh, between ports and areas of control. We also have, and I'm just going to send this over here, we also have amphs, which looks is a single ship with sort of the bow of the ship points up a little bit in the front. As I flip that, you'll see it looks very similar on this end. An amph is simply a transport ship that is used for amphibious landings. It can only carry garrisons, territorials, militia, and units capable of invading, which tends to be most infantry units, including motorized infantry. They're going to be used to support those amphibious landings. So transports are not really what you're going to want to use for invading an island or invading the coast. You're going to want to make sure to use these amph units. So they are better in that regard. But as you can see, just like transports and just like convoys, they're really not good for anything else. But they're going to be worthwhile having. Special note you should keep in mind is that the United States has restrictions on building these until they've taken certain entry options. So you won't be pumping these out in large numbers very quickly. Set those guys over there. Okay, and then besides those, the convoys, the transports, and the amphs, you have your typical actual combat naval vessels. So there are the surface combat ships. So basically anything that is not a sub or a carrier is going to be one of these. Now, if you're playing with Ships in Flames as part of the Deluxe Edition, these are going to include both ships that would be considered light cruisers, or cruisers or battleships. It's really just going to depend on what their build costs are going to be. So, like, here's a 2-2. This is, I believe, basically a considered like I want to say this is considered a battleship, but really what you're caring about is the again, that they're surface combat ships, they're surface vessels. Some of the force pull stuff here, so like here's a light carrier. I'm going to flip this so you can compare the silhouettes here. So a light carrier, much smaller reverse silhouette compared to a cruiser that looks very similar. Very similar. And then finally you have the battleship. So if you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out which is which, the build cost kind of makes sense to what is a battleship, using the big black silhouette. But the game doesn't really, at least on the counters, differentiate or really even care very much about whether or not these are CAs, CLs, or battleships. But that's something you really only need to worry about with Ships in Flames. If you're just playing the base game, the surface combat ships are representing whole sets of ships acting together, so you don't need to worry too much about the differentiation here. Obviously, then there are the subs. So some nice things about subs, and like here are some German ones that are trying to hunt for British convoys. Subs can't be intercepted. normally, so as naval units move through sea zones that may have enemies in it, those enemy units can try to intercept and stop those units, but subs can't be intercepted except by special sub-hunter units, which that's a detail I'm probably not going to go too deeply into in this video, just that there are some units that have sub-hunter traits and can actually be used to intercept subs. And really, subs, while they can be used as a part of surface naval combat to support just a general naval battle, they're really going to be used for convoy attacks, mostly during submarine combat. Again, to try to knock out convoys, as sort of was the historical use case for at least the Germans and their U-boats. The final one here that we ought to talk about are carriers, and obviously, this is sort of an important unit in a lot of ways. The carrier units, they're going to be distinctive looking. So here's an example. Here's the Furious. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. So, a couple of things. If you're playing the base game, the counter for the Furious is going to look a little bit different in terms of the numbers, but it'll still be called the Furious. In the base game, that lower right-hand number is the air component of the carrier. And when it comes to performing air-type actions, carriers can be involved in port strikes and naval air combat. And when they do that, they need to take their air component and split it between air-to-air rating, a plane with that rating for air-to-air combat, or air-to-sea combat. So, for example, the Furious is kind of a weaker aircraft carrier. Its rating is only a 2. We could either have it operate in combat, if this was the base game, as a 2 air-to-air combat factor plane and a 0 air-to-sea factor, or 0 air-to-air and 2 air-to-sea, or 1 and 1, right? Not a whole lot of flexibility because we only have 2 points, but that's what it would be. Better class aircraft carriers might have like a 5, so you can do 3 and 2 or 2 and 3 or whatever. And that whenever you have this set up, the air-to-sea rating, the tactical factors and strategic factors, if you want to use the carriers this way, it's going to be the tactical factors will be half whatever you assign to air-to-sea and 1/10 for strategic. So in this example for the Furious, if we said, okay, we're going to make all 2 points go to air-to-sea, and we're going to use it for a tactical bombing, to do tactical bombing in a combat, then it's going to be, 1/2 of 2 is only 1. Obviously, 1/10 of 2 is not even a whole number, so it's not going to be useful to do strategic bombardment with a carrier like this. And again, that is just the nature of the carriers in the base game. Now, I'm trying to be careful because I don't want to do too much description of air mechanics, because I'm going to do a separate video around air warfare and air mechanics later. But just to suffice to say, the CVs are naval units that can act like an air unit, depending on how they're used in the base game. However, in the advanced sort of deluxe game with ships and flames, and with you're using carriers and planes and flames, basically just the rule to say, yeah, we're going to use this. What ends up happening is that you have these special airplane units as a separate force pool. They're referred to as CVPs, so carrier planes. And basically the way it works is they're going to have their own lettered box on here, and you're really going to look for that lettered box at the start anyway to match the aircraft carrier. So when you're playing with ships and flames and with the carriers and carrier planes and flames option, you're basically just going to look and say, okay, I have the Furious. It by itself doesn't have any air capability. We need to put a plane on it, And so in this case, we have this plane unit, which we've produced, and is now associated or placed on top of this aircraft carrier. And we have another one here as well. We actually have the Courageous, and I've put this Nimrod with this aircraft carrier. And so what basically happens now is that this plane is attached to this aircraft carrier, and it acts just like any other aircraft unit. It has an air-to-air rating here. It's got an air-to-sea rating here. All the other values, they're not used for anything else, and this is just what they're capable of doing. And what can happen is, this plane can get shot down, but the carrier is fine and can actually have another carrier plane, come and return to base to it. And, again, because all a carrier plane really is the platform to provide air capabilities remotely. You're just changing and you're providing a more granular level of how is that portrayed in the game. So, kind of interesting. The other thing that is present here is on the back of these carrier planes. Every 2 years or so, the plane changes its class. So this goes from orange, which is the 2 class, to blue, light blue, which is the 1 class. What can end up happening is you can fit up to 2 carrier planes on a single aircraft carrier as long as the present class for the planes together are the same class as the Furious or less. So a quick example of that is that if this was 1940, this is no longer an orange CVP plane. It's actually a light blue CVP plane. So if we had another one, and I'm just going to clone it for the sake of ease here. We have 2 of them. It's 1940. Both are light blue, meaning class 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, matching the capability of the Furious. We could actually have both of these units now on the 1 aircraft carrier. And the way this really ends up working is a lot of the later aircraft carriers are quite good in terms of their class. So they might have a class of like 4 or 5 or 6. And so a 6 could fit 2 class 3 carrier planes on it, right? And those those 3 class planes are going to be a lot better than a 1 class plane, and so on. So there's a certain dynamic of capability that changes in the game as you go. Kind of neat. Okay, and then the only other thing probably worth mentioning is that when we're out here in the sea zones, while the naval stuff and the aircraft carriers are great, there are planes that can operate out of ground basing to be involved in air-naval combat or naval air combat and do patrolling. Those planes either have to be fighters, FTRs, so these planes that fly lateral here on the icon on the counter, or they need to be planes with an actual air-to-sea value. So a lot of these, let's say, I don't know if I have any good examples on here. If there's I don't have any good examples. If there's a bomber that has a asterisk in the upper right, it can't go out to sea. And then there are also special plane units that fly sort of diagonally on their counter. These are nav bombers, and they are sort of meant to be planes that can operate off the ground or in land to go out to sea and perform actions. And I've set up a couple of Axis ones here to sort of demonstrate how they can get involved. And so if the Germans took an action to move these air units, how this works is that you take whatever air unit you're going to move out to sea, you're going to move it from its origin hex to a hex dot hex in the sea zone. So if these guys are all going to go out to the Bay of Biscay, first we move it to here. That's going to cost 1. So if its range is 13, it has 12 left. And then whichever C box you're going to end up in is going to depend on how much range you have left, and there's sort of a simple math equation for it. If you can add up the numbers in the furthest box and it's your range or less, you can put it there. So you would need a 1 or a 2 range left over to reach 0 box or the 1 box. You would need 3 or more if you wanted to end up in the 2 box. You need 6 or more if you wanted to be in the 3 box, because you add 1, 0, 1, 2, and 3 to get 6. And then if you wanted to be in the 4 box, you would need at least 10 range left over. So this particular unit here, 1, it has 12 left, can go in the 4 box. This one moves 1, 2, it has 7 left. It can only go into the 3 box. Sort of try to figure out a more convenient place to put them. Nope, I'll just put them on top. And then this guy's got a huge amount of range, so could actually maybe send him pretty far. I wonder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then could go into the 2 box. Yeah. Nah, we'll just go ahead and put them in the 4 box. Screw it. You can see some of these units have very long ranges, which means they can go very far and still wind up in a decent C box very far away. But in this case, we're just going to concentrate these air units here in this location. Okay, so I just covered the naval units again, a kind of a long review of naval units and the air units that can help and be involved in naval matters. So I think we'll mark this as a bookmark spot, and we'll move into naval combat. Okay, so when it comes to naval combat, there are really 3 kinds of naval combat. There's naval air combat, I should say, surface naval combat, and submarine naval combat. With all of these, surprise points play a very large role in how well that combat is going to actually go for you. So what will happen is when you move units out to sea, someone might intercept, and so they'll roll a die, and that's an excellent roll. They will look to see, okay, how low did I roll, and then compare that to these C boxes, and if I've rolled that number or below, then they are involved in my combat. I may have successfully searched and found the enemy. Now, in an interception, if you rolled that might be a success, and if the person decided once they got intercepted that they wanted to fight that battle, then it would be used. Otherwise, if you just have units out here floating around, then you're going to roll to see, basically if I had rolled that as the Germans, that would mean that these subs all were able to find the enemy, and then the opposite player would roll in that C zone to try to determine which of their units may have found anyone. And I rolled a 6, which unfortunately is not going to be enough for the Commonwealth. So if this was the example play, the Germans rolled a 1, their subs found the enemy, and the Commonwealth found nothing, then what's probably going to happen is, one, the Germans are going to aim to attack a single C box to be involved, and it's going to be the 0 box, and then their surprise is basically going to be quite good, right? Because it's like the enemy's roll, which was 6, plus the highest C box that they have involved units, which is a 3, so they'll have 9 surprise points. The Commonwealth will have 1, and then you subtract that. So really, it's going to be the Germans have 8 surprise points to spend on the surface combat here, or the naval combat here. Part of that is for 4 surprise points, you're going to get to pick that type of combat: air, surface, or submarine combat. And obviously, you're going to pick one when this happens that is advantageous to you, and it's really just going to depend on what the force is and what the capabilities are to do it. If there's not enough surprise to determine the combat type, though this is something you'll probably want to do, or you choose not to spend surprise points on determining the combat type, then how it shakes out is sort of based on a priority. So if it's your turn, you may choose to make the combat Naval Air Combat if you have an aircraft or an undamaged carrier, or an undamaged carrier with a carrier plane if you're playing with the deluxe stuff. And the weather is neither storm nor blizzard, so if the weather's clear enough for airplanes and you have planes there, you can opt to have this be a Naval Air Combat. If you don't, then the opponent who has air units there could make it a Naval Air Combat. And so, like in this case here, the Commonwealth definitely has air units. They would possibly choose to make this Naval Air Combat instead, if the Germans wouldn't use their surprise to make it a submarine combat, which is probably what they would do here. So otherwise, let's say if you're fighting a battle with no aircraft units, then the active player could choose to make it a submarine combat if they have a sub there and the opponent has convoy points. Otherwise, if they choose to not do that, but the opponent has submarines, they could try to make it a submarine combat. And if neither of that's the case, or they don't opt into it, then it's just going to be a surface combat. So there's sort of a weird hierarchy here, and a lot of it is because if you can use air units for naval air combat, that it's probably going to be very beneficial than letting it be a big battleship slugfest. If you have that air superiority advantage, then you can have those air units cause damage to surface ships that, and it's going to mean your surface ships aren't even touched by it. So I guess, in terms of, again, it comes down to what units do you have in that area. Air is great if you've got air superiority. Otherwise, it's going to depend on do you have subs or what. And obviously, if you're a fleet of surface ships and you're facing down an enemy fleet with aircraft carriers, but you have surprise, then you're probably going to opt to use surprise points to make it a surface battle so that you have a chance of sinking those aircraft before the air can be involved, right? It's stuff like that. It's the combat system in the naval game here is very, very deterministic, meaning that, all things the same, there are certain values that you can expect. The variation, rather than in, say, like the land combat of this game where you roll, your D10s and you look up the modifiers and you get some sort of result and there's this wide range of results, the variation is not in all of that. The variation is in the surprise points, and the surprise points are really going to govern how that combat pans out. And just to kind of go through what those surprise points can be spent on, so you can choose to avoid combat if you don't think the combat's going to be good. You can choose that combat type, obviously making it something that's beneficial to you. You can use it to select the target of losses, which typically isn't always going to be the case. You can also use it to increase or decrease, shift your or your opponent's column on the naval combat chart. So basically, having you get a better result as if you had more ships or better combat factors, or decreasing the enemy's combat ability as if they had fewer combat factors. And then you can also modify air-to-air values when you're conducting air combat as part of a naval air combat phase. So all of that to say, obviously the surprise points are really important, and that's really going to be where the chance is. So when you roll the dice and you roll very low, that's good for you, and if your opponent rolls really high, that's good for you. And really, there's sort of a cap on how many surprise points you're going to possibly have at all. But there's some obvious ways you're going to want to spend it, and then go to town. What's nice about that is that rather than just having no idea if you're going to have a whole fleet sink in a naval combat because of weird dice rolls, there is sort of a boundary of possible things that could happen, and it allows you to plan a little bit better. You'll know if you're going to need more ships, or if you have too many and not enough combat factors, and you're just going to be, a big wide target. You can kind of figure out what those deterministic odds are going to be a little bit differently. And some of the time, honestly, when you roll those search checks, you roll those numbers based on the C boxes. It could very well be that both people miss. That if I rolled, we're going to do this again, 5 failure and then a 10 a failure, then no sea combat, no naval combat is going to occur in these sea zones. So, it's a bunch of either, nothing happens, or then a lot of stuff happens, which is kind of fun. And you look forward to those big naval combats. So, let's see. Let's get into now the specific combat types and talk about how to process each one. And maybe we'll even do an example of one here as we go. So let me just grab my timestamp. Okay, so let's talk about surface combat first, because it's the most straightforward one that can be covered. And really, when this comes up, it's simply going to be a factor of, are there subs? Are there air around? Does an air inferiority naval stack? Are they facing an air superiority stack, and they want to use surface combat to take out the aircraft carriers? That's really where this is going to come down to. It's very, very simple to process this by comparison to the other types. So if you look at the naval combat chart, so if you own the game, you're going to want to look at the charts that came with the game. On the inside of the big chart there's the 11.5 naval combat chart. You're going to want to look at that. And I'm going to look real quick to see if it's actually in the Vassal module. I'm not sure that it is. Oh, it's right here. Oh, that's fantastic. This Vassal module is great. Okay. So if you're fighting a surface naval combat, what you're going to do is each side separately are going to add up all of the attack factors of their ships involved in the combat. And again, this is going to be the top left number here. You're going to add them all up. You're going to end up somewhere in this red row here, one of the columns. You're then going to compare, once you've got your column, you're then going to compare that to the number of enemy ships that you are actually in combat with. If you're playing the base game, then it's going to be, I think, every 5 convoy are a ship. And then I think if you're playing with Ships and Flames, it's every 3 convoy points are a ship. You're going to cross-reference that, and then you're going to look in the green bits of the chart here. So let's say, let's try to find ourselves an example. I think we might want to go to Pacific for this. Oops. Come on. Okay, so let's say these guys are all... Let's do this. Okay. So we just made all of these guys come out to 2 box, this American fleet, very large fleet, I might add, very, very large, huge, in fact, and they rolled very well against the Japanese. In fact, they have surprise compared to the Japanese, and they are going to, the Japanese did not find the Americans because they rolled a 10. We'll say this will be an extreme example. With the surprise points that the Americans have, they're going to choose to make it a surface combat instead of a naval air combat because of the presence of these aircraft carriers. They want to try to destroy those. Wouldn't that be great? So let's figure this out, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to total up those attack factors. We're going to compare to enemy number of ships. So let me get need to grab the chart again. We're going to compare it to the enemy number of ships, and then that's going to tell us how many X, D, and A results need to be processed. And to put it simply, an X is a sink result, a D is a damaged result, and an A is an abort result. And for each of these, as we look at it and process it, we need to we'll roll for the unit that's being targeted against their defense value. And if we roll their number or less, if we roll less than their number, they will take one less result. So as an example, if we had the Mogami take an X result, and we rolled a 5 on the die, less than 6, that sink result, the X, becomes a D, and the Mogami is simply damaged rather than sunk. And both sides will figure this out and apply it at the same time, basically, so that there's no oh, I hit all of your guys and then you can't hit me back. Both will take place, and if there's any surprise points left here, the Americans could decide to shift their column to the right or shift the Japanese columns to the left. I'm going to, for this demonstration, simply say that they used all of their available surprise to make this a surface naval combat, and that's it. Now, one thing that I'm going to bring up before we resolve this combat is just that there is an optional rule in the rulebook around screening. And screening is kind of an interesting optional rule. And what it does is, one, it makes so that convoys must always be screened if they're involved in the combat. In this case, there are none. But if you have screening as an option that you're playing with, somebody can pick units in their stack to essentially not be involved in the combat until all the other non-screened units have been destroyed. They can't contribute their combat factors to the battle, but they still add their number to the enemy ships count for determining the number of losses inflicted. And what it allows you to do basically is protect certain ships if you think they are in danger. And it also is set up a little bit differently where without that rule, combat losses, the owner will always decide who takes whichever losses need to be applied unless surprise was used. But with screening, if you're using screening, then all losses are alternated between the owner of the unit and the attacker. It's a little bit different, and I'm used to using the screening rule because it's in Fatal Alliances, the World War I game. So I'm debating on using it in this example because I think this would actually be a pretty good one to try for this. Let me think about that for a second. Well, I'll do it without because I'm not sure it's going to truly matter. So let's figure out what the Americans are going to do to the Japanese. So we have this gigantic fleet that is coming. So we have 7, 13, 20, 34, 41, 48, 51, 54, 57, 60, 68, 74, 81. Woo! Okay, so if I counted right, hopefully I did. 81 versus the number of ships, which is simply 4, actually. And if we look, 3 to 4 enemy ships against 81 is 221. 221. So this would be an interesting case here, because if we had screened these, we might have kept all the aircraft carriers protected, but then almost guaranteed that the other accompanying escort units would be destroyed. But because we aren't screening, because I've decided just to not do the screening for this, it's going to be a little bit different, right? So this is going to be a 2-2-1 result. I'm going to put in the box up here: 2x, 2d, 2a. Now the way this works is that you must do all the x's first, then the d's, then the a's. So if we're playing without screening, this will be an interesting example to show, because we could compare what those combat results would look like. I'm just gonna, we'll just move the planes off for a second, because they won't matter for this. So if it were, again, 2x, 2d, 2a, it would be, obviously the Japanese player is going to say, well, I'm going to take, let's do the x. So the first x is going to be against this guy, and we would roll, and there's a pretty good chance that he's going to actually take the hit. I think I got, my explanation was a little bit backwards before, but basically the lower the number, it is better. If you roll above that number, they're fine. So if we roll a 7 or less, he's going to become sunk. So let's roll a die. So we roll a die, and I rolled an 8. So he is actually damaged. So let's see if I've got, I suspect, damaged. There we go. Oh, isn't that cool? Oh, this vassal module is great. Okay, so that was 1x. Now, the Japanese owner could say, well, I could apply the next x against this guy as well. And I think it makes sense to do that, because it could mean that if this fails, this unit's just gone, but at most now it can maybe only be damaged. So we'll say the Miyoko will take the second sink result, and we'll roll another die. And, okay, so this is now sunk. So, I don't want to get rid of it yet, because I want to compare, so we'll throw it over here. So he was sunk. Now we have 2 damage results, so we'll roll for the Mogami again. The owner of these units is picking. It doesn't want the aircraft carriers to be destroyed, so we roll. Oh, it got damaged. So there you go. And now we'll say, yeah, we want the next damage result to be against the unit here. I'm trying to think if maybe there's any other way to go about this. But no, this is probably still the best option. So we'll roll again for the second damage result. And a 3, and yeah, it's destroyed as well. And now we have the 2 abort results, which we will apply. Let's see. It'd be better to abort this guy. He's the better carrier, but they're probably all going to be, the Japanese player's probably going to choose to abort these guys to get them to safety against this big, in the current circumstances of this fleet combat. So, but we'll roll. So against the 8, yeah, he's aborted. So abort, and then this guy for the other abort result, and he actually succeeds. But we would probably, as the Japanese players, say, you know what, this is a little too hot, and this guy's going to be left all alone. He'd probably willingly abort these guys. So if we were not screening, in this case and in this example, the way it came out with the dice was that the escort ships were destroyed, but the aircraft carriers still managed to avoid things. But let's reverse time a little bit and pretend this was with screening instead. Rack them up again. And remove the damaged markers on these guys. I like that. I love that in this vassal module. Very cool touch. Okay, so with screening, we're going to say that, let's see, so if these guys, yeah, we would have had the carriers be screened, which means that they do not add their attack factor to the round, which is fine. They don't really have great combat factor anyway. But they still count towards the enemy number of ships. So if we were doing the same thing, again, 221 being the results, 2x, 2d, 2a. Now it's these guys are being screened, so they're over here, and we have the 2x's. So again, we're going to roll for the Miyoko. Unfortunately, he is sunk. And now we have the other result, which now, because the attacker would get to pick a target to suffer a result, but unfortunately, I, as the Americans, can only pick the Mogami because the Japanese player already selected the Miyoko for that. So we'll roll for the Mogami. The Mogami actually avoids being sunk and is simply damaged, which is unfortunate for the Americans because what would have happened now is, had that succeeded in destroying the Mogami, then we would have the 2 damage results that we could apply to the aircraft carriers once the Mogami was gone. But now we're on to our first damage result, which the Japanese player has to select the Mogami, so we'll roll. And that succeeded. So this is damaged again, which a unit that's been damaged is going to be sunk. But now we have another damage result, and that damage result is going to be selected by the Americans, and they're going to get to pick which of these aircraft carriers they want to try to damage, and they're going to target the Hiryu, I think. So we're going to roll. We'll see. And yeah, okay, so this is now damaged, and you know, the effect here is basically that, maybe a little bit better because it just depends on those die rolls. This might not have been a great example to show why screening might be good in some cases. We might need some bigger examples for that, but there are some differences because, again, it allows you to protect things, you know, as it goes. But as it stands here, in that surface combat, the Americans would have done very well here. Now, let's look at the reverse, right? Technically, this would still happen no matter what, but what did the Japanese do to the Americans? Well, I'm going to remove these so I can see a little bit better. If they were screening, they would only have an attack power of 8. If we weren't doing screening, then they would have an attack power... I can't move my plane out of the way. Would have an attack power of 10 because this aircraft carrier doesn't have any additional attack power. So 4, 8, 10. The difference on here, there is a difference. So the 8 would be on the 6 to 9 column. The 10 would be on the 10 to 4 column. So it would matter. If we weren't doing screening, then those units would have been involved and would have at least helped a little tiny bit in possibly doing damage to the Americans. If we look at the number of ships, the Americans have quite a number here. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It's a very large fleet of ships. So we look on this, and depending on if we had picked screening, it was either going to be 2 destroys and an abort, or 1 sink and 1 abort. And I'm not sure which one's really better. I mean, I guess totally sinking a unit is probably better. And in this case, because this set of units are really just a bunch of big ships and whatever, probably wouldn't have bothered screening anything if we were playing with screening. If we weren't playing with screening, we would use ships like the Omaha, and the Brooklyn, and the Portland, and New Orleans, Chicago, to take hits so that our big beefy ships are safe, or maybe we'd have the big ships take the hit because they have much better armor and are more likely to take those hits, right? And I think, for instance, if we had to take the damage rolls, it'd probably be better to take those damages against the big ships, because if they can succeed with the armor check, then it's just aborts, and that's not a big deal. If it's sinking, we might be more happier to lose one of these smaller, weaker ships, because if we failed one of those armor checks on the big ship, then they're sunk, and that's a lot of production now gone that we'd have to replace. So kind of interesting how you work that out. And like all of the naval combats, like we would resolve that, the units that would abort. Then we'd have the potential for yet another search roll. So all the parties, all the ships in the sea zone would have another chance, another crack at being involved in a second round of combat. So, maybe if these ships were lost, but the aircraft carriers survived, and then we rolled really well as the Japanese on the next go and got surprise on the Americans, then we might have, a decent number of these battleships with the aircraft carrier, and maybe we'd have enough surprise to do a naval air combat, which would be potentially better for the Japanese, though in this case, this fleet's so big, I'm not sure it would make sense to do that. But anyway, let's look at the next. I think we want to look into the next type of combat. Again, the surface naval combat is really straightforward. You're simply comparing attack factors to the number of ships, and then determining who are going to have the potential losses, and you have this sort of, it really reminds me of D&D tabletop role-playing games where you're making attack throws and saving throws and stuff. You're making saving throws for each ship that is going to potentially take a loss. So it's very straightforward from that perspective. Really, really easy to follow. So this example was great. So let's start talking about naval air combat next. So again, naval air combat is going to be important when, say, we have, and I think maybe I'm going to want to use an example over here. When we have a, let's see, I want to pick a good area where this example would be pretty interesting. Yeah, not the best examples. Okay, we'll do this. I'm just going to grab some ships, and we're going to throw them in the 3 box as well. Okay. Okay, so naval air combat is a little bit different. obviously, you're going to want to pick it if you have air superiority, and in the case here in the North Sea, the Commonwealth definitely do. They actually have their 2 aircraft carriers with accompanying carrier planes here. And what you would do then is if you're going to do a naval air combat, again, we'll suppose, for instance, that either by surprise or otherwise, the Commonwealth has made sure that this is going to be a naval air combat. You're basically going to determine what units are going to be fighters and which units are going to be bombers that are involved in the combat. Actually, come to think of it, we're gonna use this example down here. This actually is probably it's not quite as good. I have an idea. I'm going to take. I should have set this up a little bit differently for this example. Let's swap out this carrier for these 2 carriers. Make it a little more interesting. Probably going to be a bloodbath for the Germans, but we'll see what happens here. Yeah, this is probably going to go very badly for the Germans, but we'll see what happens. Okay. Oh, they have a sub out here, but we'll ignore that. We'll focus on naval air combat. So let's suppose that the Germans wanted this to be a naval air combat, or mutually they decide they want this to be a naval air combat combat, right? So what we need to do is each side is going to determine who the fighters and who the bombers are going to be involved in the combat. And let's just assume that everyone in the 3 and 4 box end up becoming involved in this combat, and that way it'll be complicated but not too complicated, right? So I think, and we'll use the air-to-air mat here, handy dandy. See, this unit has a better air-to-air rating, so we're going to make this a fighter. He could go either way, so let's make him a bomber. And we'll make him a bomber as well. And let's see. For these guys, we'll have him be a bomber, and we'll have him be a fighter. That's the first thing you would do. And to make this a little more interesting, I will grab... Let's do this guy. Let's see, do 1, 2, he could be in the 4 box. And we'll grab another one of equal movement allowance. Yeah, let's just move that guy as well. So these 2 guys will join. What you're really doing when you're doing naval air combat like this is you're looking at what air units are available in the area. They're going to do an air combat fight, and then when that is resolved, we're then going to have the bombers that were cleared through attempt to do a bombing run. Okay? So I don't want to do a full demonstration of air combat because that's going to take too long. So let's pretend for a second like the air combat results lead us to having this unit destroyed. So I'm going to simply, I'm going to flip this guy. Or I accidentally got rid of him. That's fine too, whatever. Oh, there he is. Okay. Flip him. I'm going to close this for a second. So let's say that bomber got shot down, that the Commonwealth bomber actually was shot down by this fighter. This fighter failed to do anything, and that these guys both were cleared. So yeah, that will, for demonstration purposes here, we'll do that. So Good job. So these guys go back to the boxes that they were in previous, or the aircraft carrier, which doesn't really matter which one this one goes back to. I guess actually, sorry. He's going to stay in the air for right now. So these guys are cleared. And he's still in the air, and he'll look to land, hopefully on a carrier plane that's still there. Okay, so now that we've cleared our bombers, we've got basically 3 air-to-sea factors that are coming right now. Yep, it's going to be 3. So I'm just making sure. Yeah, air-to-sea. Okay, so we've got 3 air-to-sea that are going to be coming at this stack of Commonwealth units. But first, what we're going to have is anti-aircraft fire. So, what we're going to do is we are going to add up all the anti-air factors of the naval units here. I suspect it's going to be quite a bit, or at least a decent amount. So it's the bottom left. So we've got 1, 3, 5, 6, 8. So 8. We're going to look at the naval combat charts, and we're going to say, okay, we're talking about anti-air. So we have 8. So we're on the 6 to 9. How many enemy bombers? We have 2. And now you look under the yellow AA chart, and we get this really weird result. -1/4. What on earth does that mean? Well, it's really kind of interesting. So the first number is the number of dice that you're going to use to get the value. And the second number is how many dice you're rolling. So in this case, we are going to roll 4 dice, and we're going to use one of them, and because it's a negative, we're going to use the worst result of the 4. So I can't imagine that this is going to actually destroy any of these planes, but we're going to go ahead and roll 4 dice. 1, 9, 5, 3. Well, 1 was the lowest out of that. So the result is a 1. So now with the result of 1, you look at how to apply those results. So for every 10 points from the total, of which we only have 1, so it's definitely not anywhere near 10, for every 10, the player firing the anti-aircraft, meaning the Commonwealth, could destroy one enemy land-based bomber, or 2 carrier planes, or 1 carrier plane, and abort a land-based bomber. If they had 5, they could abort an enemy land-based bomber or destroy 1 enemy carrier plane. And then for every remaining point in the total, you would get 1 air-to-sea factor does not press the attack. So we only have 1 as our result, which isn't very good. So 1 air-to-sea factor does not press the attack. And what this means is for the next phase, which is the air-to-sea attack, we have 3. 1, 2, 3. There's 2 here, 1 here. One of these factors is not going to be used in the damage calculation. And so it's effectively meaning we don't use this guy. He just isn't able to get close enough to a ship to damage any, but he's still in the area. So we're only going to be using the 2. So now we use the air-to-sea, and 2, that leads us to be on the 2 column here. And we're going to cross-reference that, let's see, and it's going to be used just like a naval combat in terms of enemy ships. So if we look, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 enemy ships. So 5 enemy ships on the air-to-sea 2. We're going to get 1 damage result. And as opposed to regular naval combat without screening, where the owner just picks everything, the attacking player and the defending player are going to alternate picking targets, and the attacking player has first pick. Unfortunately, we're only going to get the one result to apply, but the Germans are going to get to select who to try to apply it against. I think we want to apply this against the Courageous. I think that's who we want to apply it against. So 1 damage result against the Courageous. We're going to roll the die. I think I just rolled, oh yeah, there we go. I rolled a 5. That is under a 7. The Courageous is damaged. And so now that is over. The Nimrod unit has to land somewhere. Now, fortunately, that bomber of theirs did get destroyed, and I don't think can land. I don't think they can land on a damaged aircraft carrier. I have to double check that rule here. Let me see here. Yeah, I'm trying to determine here if it's a damaged CVs, if it matters if you can land on it. Okay. All right. Yeah, I found it. Sorry. It's in section 14 of the rules when it talks about carrier planes. So technically, this Nimrod could land on the Courageous even though it's damaged, but it can then not fly from it because you can't fly planes off a damaged carrier plane. But so we'll have the Nimrod land on the Furious with the end of combat. And yeah, so that was the end of that. And of course, when this is over, get this stacked back up. After the Naval Air Combat, all surviving aircraft remain in their C box unless they were aborted. So these guys would have, stayed here. The Courageous would have to have aborted at the end of this combat, if and only if we didn't have another round of naval combat. So this is something that's probably worth pointing out here, that when all of this is done, if there are still units here, we give each side more die rolls to search. And if it ends up being that we don't find each other, then it's ended here, and then the Courageous would abort. So there very well could be a case of combat occurs again, and maybe it's a naval air combat based on the Germans rolling well, and maybe they look to destroy the Courageous before it can flee. That's my understanding, is that these damaged units, they don't abort until either the players opt to abort all of their units, or the combat's over, all the combats are over, and now the unit's gonna head back. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So here, the decision point here, just to kind of illustrate that, would be after this round is over, which went well for the Germans, the Commonwealth, if they wanted to protect the Courageous, could abort, but they'd have to abort everything here, which they probably wouldn't want to do, so they would have to risk it, and then it would be a matter of, are there going to be searches, right? So the German searches, oh, and the German does well, and then the Commonwealth searches and does terribly. What you would see is another repeat, only this time, they're going to, if they were to choose Naval Air Combat again, it would be, pretty rough because there'd only be the one plane here. It would probably be defeated, and then you'd probably see, these guys attempt to bomb out and destroy that aircraft carrier entirely so they could sink one. Or maybe they do something else, right? It would just depend on what the results were. But that is Naval Air Combat. Now, obviously, if we looked at the charts very quickly, you could see there are better die rolls for the anti-aircraft, for instance. So if you have a lot of anti-aircraft, then you're going to get cases where you take, and it's non-linear, it feels like. You roll 3 dice and you take the best one. You roll 5 dice and you take the best one. You roll 6 dice and you take the worst 3 and add them together. And so there's this sort of weird, amount, but you're really looking for high rolls so you can end up taking out attacking enemy planes, or at least aborting them or getting them out of the way. So it's kind of interesting, but you can see it doesn't take very many air-to-sea bombing factors to be useful, right? I mean, we were on the 2, and we could damage something. That's great, right? Say we had it up to the 6, and we had, 8, 9, 10, 11 enemy ships, and we could be sinking one of them, right? So there's certainly some advantageous bits to doing naval air combat and taking out ships, because again, in the naval air combat procedure, unless your enemy has naval bombers of their own that could attack your ships, there's a very strong possibility any surface ships that you have present are not going to be affected by combat. Okay, so let's talk about the final type of naval combat, and we'll close out this video here. So the final one is submarine combat. Now, obviously, with this, it's going to come down to having submarines, enemies or yours, in an area with opposing convoys. Then submarine combat is an option. Submarines, again, can be used in surface combat if you want them to be. You can commit them and have them involved if you need that little bit of extra punch. But a majority of the time, you're going to want to have subs attacking convoys. Something worth pointing out here, the way I've had the Commonwealth set up is you have their convoys in the 0 box. We also have some escort ships in the 0 box with them, because if the enemy gets surprise on you and they select a single C box to attack, if you've put some ships in the 0 box with your convoys, the convoys can't be attacked in isolation. These guys are probably going to have to be involved as well, which is one way to help defend them. So escorts for the convoys, as opposed to maybe a more risky strategy, which is to put some units not with the convoy in higher level boxes as sort of your own hunter groups that can patrol very well to try to find the enemy and take them out before take out subs and stuff with aircraft before anything can happen to the convoys. So I've sort of set up each of these sea zones as an example where I'm kind of trying to do both. I've got a few ships protecting the convoys, and then I've got ships out here that would look to get involved with enemy vessels and destroy them before the convoys could get touched, because they have really good search value. Anyway, let's look at the submarine combat. So first thing, if it's going to be a submarine combat, if that's what's chosen, then 2 separate combats could take place if both sides have subs and convoys there. I'm not sure how often that's going to come up. It might come up in the Pacific sometimes, when the Japanese and the Americans maybe both have convoys trying to get to certain islands or something, and in which case the active side is going to take care of their sub combat first. Sorry, I had to take a drink. My throat's getting dry. All right, so submarine combat is relatively straightforward. So let's do. I'm going to toss some dice and just see. Let's see what happens here. Oh, one for the Germans. Okay, all the German subs are involved, and oh yeah, and too bad, so sad. The Commonwealth didn't roll well enough. We'll just say that they didn't get anything, and the Germans are going to use their surprise. Again, we're going to make sure it's a sub-combat, and they're going to do it here. So what you're going to do is you're going to add up the non-sub, meaning enemies that are not subs. You're going to add up their ASW factors. ASW meaning anti-submarine warfare. Add up their factors and compare that to the number of subs as the enemy ships look up on the chart. So on page 29 of the rulebook, there's a table, and I think it's somewhere on one of these maps. Oh, here it is. Here we go. This table is going to govern how many anti-submarine warfare factors you will have. And it's going to depend on if you're just playing the base game of WIF. You're going to look at that. If you're using any of these other options, then you're going to get a different number based on what you're using. And I think I have this set up to use CL in flames, light cruisers in flames. So I think that's what we're going to look at here. Let's see. Now, if this combat was involving these units as well, they would potentially get to add their ASW factors to the combat, but because they've been excluded from the combat because the Germans had surprise and decided, they found the enemy and the Commonwealth did not find the Germans, that they only want the 0 box involved with this combat. Let's see here. Yeah, so they would have picked here, and so we look at what are the ASW factors for these units here. So let's see. Every 5 full convoy points would be 1, but unfortunately, we don't have 5 convoy points. We only have 3, so they're not going to get one ASW factor for that. Let's see what else we have here. We actually have a number of different units. So this is I believe that is a light cruiser. Also a light cruiser. Is that still a light cruiser? It looks like it is. Yep. And then we have that also looks like it might be a light cruiser. I don't think it's a CA. Oh, maybe it is a CA. Yeah, it's got a black silhouette, so that must be a CA. Okay. So if we look at that, and let's just assume this is 1941, all of those are going to be 1 ASW factor each at this point. So we're going to have 4 ASW factors. Flip all these guys back. So if we look at our chart, there is a line for subs and ASW, and we're going to have 4 ASW factors, and we're going to compare that then to the number of subs that are going to be used in the combat. So let's see, we had, what was it, 3, I think? 1, 2, 3, okay. So So, let's see. Okay. So, let's see. Yeah, I believe this is simultaneous, so I was looking to see if maybe if we destroyed some subs, would that keep them from destroying convoys, but I think this is all done simultaneously. At least I believe that's my understanding. So let's look at then, so they had the 4 ASW against 4 or 3 to 4 enemy ships, so we have a D, 1D, 2A. 1D, 2A. And these are going to be we're going to have to look and decide how we want to resolve this. So again, because we're not using screening, and I don't think that would be a factor here, we're going to have to decide how we want to take this. All the subs are not really great armor, so we're going to have the damage go to this one here. So we'll roll, and yeah, he's damaged. And then the 2 abort, so we'll have an abort go here. And yeah, he's going to be aborted. And then this guy here for the other abort. And he'll also be aborted. So all of these guys are going to be aborted. One's damaged, so that's not the best that could have happened. And so now we'll look at what did the subs do to this set of folks here. And just to, we have 2, 4, 7 sub combat factors. So if we look at this, so instead of using the surface track, we're using sub. So we have 7 factors. And let's see. The number of units here in the 0 box. So this is going to be 1 unit for the convoys, and then the 4 here. So 5. So 6, 7, 5, 2D, and 3A. 2D, 3A. Now this is a little bit different. Losses inflicted by the sub are going to work. Every odd loss must be convoy points, and every even loss must be either convoy points or another unit in the 0 C box section that isn't a transport or an amphibious unit. So let's see, we're going to the first damage is going to be on the convoys, so let's see. Do I not have a good way to mark this? Forget how these are marked if they're damaged. Drat, I guess there's no damaged setting for these guys. So the convoys are damaged, and they will have to be dealt with, and then the second damage is going to be against one of these units here, and you know, we'll give it to Suffolk. and that is too bad. So the Suffolk is damaged, and then well, actually, see, there's a special rule in here that once there are no further convoys to suffer losses, all remaining losses inflicted by the subs are ignored. So the A result would be against the next A result would be against the convoys, which would be aborted, damaged. So unfortunately, I can't set this to damaged. I'll have to mark them some other way, or mark movement trail. I will do that. We'll rotate it here for a second. I'll have to look at the convoys and see what else is done with them if they're damaged. There might be a marker that I can use. Oh, here we go. I think if I... Nope. Maybe it's like this. I'll mark it like so. Because they were damaged and then aborted, there's nothing more that can be done to these guys, and so the final abort would actually be ignored. And so by the end of the combat, these guys would sit here in the 0 box unless the Commonwealth chose to abort them. These guys are all going to have to abort and go home, so they would go home to some port in Vichy, France, is what I've sort of set up the scenario to be. So we'll just throw them here for now. This guy would have to abort, and maybe he would abort to Gibraltar, and then these convoy points would probably, I guess because they're damaged, they would go to the repair pool. I'll have to look at that. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's all good there. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that worked out. All right, so yeah, okay. So yeah, there should be, I'm not sure why it's not in here. There should be a damaged marker for these guys. Yeah, it's weird. I'm not sure why the vassal module doesn't have that. Maybe I'm missing something here. But these were damaged and would be aborted no matter what. Anyhow, and at this point, the subs have done what they wanted to do, which was disrupt the pipeline that's coming around Africa or even through the Mediterranean. They've succeeded in doing this, so the Commonwealth would be in some trouble here because of that. Yeah. So, okay. Very long video. We're coming up on almost 2 hours. So, I hope with what I've shown here today, we've demonstrated pretty much all the big stuff related to naval mechanics in World in Flames. The reality here is that while there is a lot going on, when you're playing, if you're playing with friends or you're playing solo, you can take all of this kind of slowly and worry about your positions and figure things out. I will say there's probably some intimidating factor playing the Commonwealth if you're unfamiliar with things or you haven't done it before, because you want to make sure that you're covering all your convoys and how much is enough, and where do you not have enough protection, and whatever else is going on. I think that's something you kind of learn with time, but you certainly don't want your convoys to be operating all by themselves. For instance, you definitely want to have escorts involved. You definitely want to have units that are going to be able to hunt down those subs, or at least track them down and destroy them before before anything else comes through. Yeah. Okay. I think that is it for this video. So if there is anything else that I can think of, I will look to maybe put it in the next video. Again, I think I did a pretty good job of covering everything. Up to this point, if you've watched the other videos, you've seen the importance of movement and how movement works. You've seen the grand sort of strategy of how to take territory and operate it to extend your supply lines and operational boundaries. We've talked about the importance of convoys. We've reviewed the naval units, the air units that may be involved in naval matters, and we've gone through all the combat types, when you would execute them, and we've run through examples. So the only thing from here that you might want to look at is to review the rulebook for more in-depth subjects on some of the expansion units like the sub-hunters, and look a little bit into things like tankers. Tankers are another form of convoy that are meant to transport only oil, and with one of the options you need to use tankers instead of convoys to transport oil. So there's a little bit more here to investigate and learn about, but I think with this anyone could pick up and start rolling with it. So hope you enjoyed. If you like this video, hit the like button. Oh gosh, I'm drained here, guys. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more content like this, hit subscribe. I'm still trying to keep it going with these World in Flames videos. I do a lot of other videos like playthrough videos, reviews, general videos about the hobby, any of that kind of stuff. If you'd like to see more of that content, subscribe, and you'll see more as I can get to it. Other than that, hope you have a good day. Take care, and we'll see you next time.